Want to learn how global oil prices, the Strait of Hormuz, and high-stakes international diplomacy actually impact the world stage and your wallet? In this deep dive, I'll show you exactly how to decode the latest geopolitical chess moves between the US, Iran, and China. Stay tuned. This is going to be a game changer.
Yeah, there is so much to unpack here today.
Let's dive in. Today we're talking about the rapidly shifting US-Iran negotiations. Here's why this matters. Oil prices recently fell, and US stocks surged close to January records, simply on the hope for an end to this fighting. If you want to understand where the global economy and international security are heading, you need to focus on the three major sticking points holding up these peace talks. It's easier than you think.
It really is, once you break it down. And, for you listening, we are pulling this analysis directly from a recent Live Now WHOR from FFox transcript.
Right, featuring insights from Jonathan S. at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies.
Exactly. And our mission today is really to look past the diplomatic spin, right? We want to understand why those secret weekend talks in Pakistan stalled out completely.
Yeah, and what a permanently open Strait of Hormuz actually means for the global supply chain. Because, it sounds simple, but it's not just a light switch, is it?
Oh, not at all. Geopolitics, especially when we're talking about a bottleneck that handles a massive percentage of the world's traded oil, it operates almost entirely in the gray areas.
Right.
So to really understand why the markets are reacting the way they are right now, we have to look at the specific diplomatic announcements that just dropped over the past few days.
And we really have to start with the announcement that basically kicked off this massive market reaction. President Trump recently posted on Truth Social a statement that the White House then amplified, saying that China is, quote, very happy he is permanently opening the Strait of Hormuz.
Right, and he framed it as doing it for them and for the world.
Exactly, stating that a disruption of this magnitude will never happen again. But maybe the most critical piece of that post was the claim that China has agreed not to send weapons to Iran.
Yeah, the phrasing there is just incredibly revealing. It immediately elevates the Strait of Hormuz from, just a regional security issue to a primary point of leverage involving Beijing.
It's pulling the superpowers right into the center of the table.
Completely. It shows how deeply intertwined these global supply chains really are. Because to understand China's reaction, you have to look at the status quo before that announcement.
What was actually happening on the water?
Right. It wasn't this total impenetrable blockade where absolutely nothing moved. Tehran was actively dictating passage. They were selectively granting access, and Chinese vessels specifically were being allowed to cross unharmed.
Okay, wait, so if I'm tracking the logic here and looking at it from Beijing's perspective, if Iran was already granting Chinese ships safe passage, well, essentially giving them a VIP pass through a war zone.
Yeah, VIP pass is a good way to look at it.
Why is China reportedly so relieved by Trump's announcement of a general permanent opening? If you already have the VIP pass, you usually don't care if the main doors are thrown open to the general public, right?
You'd think so, but a VIP pass in a vacuum is practically useless.
How so?
Well, it exposes this common myth about global trade, this idea that you can isolate a supply chain bilaterally. A partial opening that only protects Chinese ships. It just isn't enough to protect China's massive macroeconomic interests.
Because it's an ecosystem.
Exactly. The global economy is highly sensitive. Just because a Chinese cargo ship safely crosses the Strait of Hormuz does not mean China's broader economic challenges are solved.
Right, so think of the strait not as a toll booth with a velvet rope, but more like a major circulatory shipping artery with a severely clogged valve.
That's a great analogy.
Iran opening the valve just enough for Chinese ships doesn't help Beijing if the rest of the global circulatory system is failing. A Chinese vessel carrying manufactured goods to Europe or coming back with raw materials from Africa, it's still derailed if European and African markets are facing severe economic contractions due to the blockade.
That captures the mechanical reality perfectly. Most countries are heavily impacted by the economic friction when that strait is compromised. If European factories slow down because energy prices spike, they order fewer components from Shenzhen.
The ripple effect.
Yeah. If global shipping insurance premiums skyrocket, the cost of everything China exports goes up. It makes them less competitive. So a compromised global supply chain inevitably damages China's domestic stability. Beijing prefers the strait to be open for everyone, unconditionally.
Because a rising tide of global commerce is the only thing that sustains their massive export economy.
Precisely. Which brings us to the second half of that Truth Social post, the assertion that China has agreed not to send weapons to Iran.
If we take that at face value, that is a massive concession.
Huge. It implies a direct transactional understanding. In exchange for stabilizing this vital economic artery, China is willing to publicly step back from militarily resupplying a nation that the U.S. is actively in conflict with.
It would signal that China's immediate need for economic stability outweighs its desire to bleed the U.S. through a proxy conflict.
But, as is always the case in high-stakes diplomacy, public announcements are one thing, the physical reality on the water is another.
And that reality is incredibly murky right now. We talk about blockades as these impenetrable walls of naval destroyers, but the FDD analysis points out something crucial. Markets are reacting to the perception of the blockade, not necessarily the watertight reality of it.
Right. Perception drives the markets.
The mere perception that things were de-escalating caused oil prices to fall and stocks to surge. Yet there are unconfirmed reports circulating that some Iranian vessels have still managed to bypass this blockade entirely.
Which really forces us to examine what an economic blockade is actually designed to achieve in the modern era. The source material notes these reports without specifying which ports these vessels are slipping into or even what kind of vessels they are.
Like, are we talking massive tankers or small smuggling craft?
Exactly, but the strategic reality is that virtually no naval blockade is perfectly sealed on day one. The operative concept here is persistence.
Persistence, meaning the administration isn't expecting a shock-and-awe capitulation overnight. It's a slow, compounding squeeze.
Precisely the opposite of a quick military strike. If the objective is to build diplomatic leverage, that inherently requires time to let the economic pain compound.
Right.
You can't expect a blockade to instantly end a conflict or force a regime to surrender its core assets in a matter of weeks. It's a blunt instrument for a long-term strategy.
Which brings up a fundamental question about this maximum pressure campaign. Are they primarily trying to build leverage for the negotiating table, or are they actively trying to starve the Iranian regime of hard currency to cause internal fractures?
Well, if you look at the mechanics of causing internal fractures, you aren't just talking about making consumer goods more expensive. You're talking about structurally starving the apparatus that keeps the regime in power.
Depriving the military and the repression apparatus of their operating budgets and salaries?
That is the core mechanism. If you cut off the international cash flow specifically from illicit oil exports, the security forces eventually start missing paychecks. And when that happens, the internal stability of the regime becomes incredibly fragile. That's the ultimate threat of maximum pressure.
But there's a deliberate caveat built into this strategy, right? The sources emphasize the absolute necessity of maintaining a humanitarian channel. Iran relies heavily on imported food, grains, and medicine.
Yes, they do.
So if the goal is maximum pressure, doesn't allowing food and medicine through inherently weaken the blockade? Like, doesn't it provide a loophole?
From a purely tactical, cold math perspective, sure, it might look like it weakens the pressure.
Yeah.
But you have to factor in the vital public relations battle, which is honestly just as important as the naval battle.
The PR battle.
Yeah. Maintaining a humanitarian channel is an absolute strategic necessity. If the U.S. wants to sustain a blockade over a long period, it cannot afford to lose the PR battle on the global stage.
Because the blockade relies on international compliance.
Exactly. The optics of enforcement are everything when secondary sanctions are involved. It has to be undeniably clear to the international community that the blockade is targeted solely against illicit oil exports and weaponry.
Not starving average citizens.
Right. If the global perception shifts and the world believes the U.S. is intentionally orchestrating a famine, Washington instantly loses the moral high ground. The international coalition enforcing the banking and shipping sanctions would just fracture under domestic political pressure in Europe and Asia.
So it's the contrast between freezing a military budget and creating empty grocery store shelves.
That's it.
If the footage out of Tehran shows RGC bases unable to fuel their trucks, the U.S. keeps its leverage. But if the footage shows civilians unable to access basic wheat or life-saving meds, the diplomatic pressure flips violently back onto Washington. The goal is to squeeze the regime's wallet, not the citizen's pantry.
That distinction is paramount, and it requires an incredibly precise, parallel strategy, strict military enforcement coexisting with a transparent humanitarian channel. And it's exactly this immense economic pressure that ultimately drove the regime to the negotiating table in Pakistan.
A table that, by all accounts, immediately collapsed.
Totally collapsed.
Let's look at those weekend talks. The stated goal was monumental: aiming to permanently end the U.S.-Iran conflict. But it failed to produce any agreement, and the messaging coming out of it was just wildly contradictory.
It's dizzying, really.
Tehran essentially claimed the U.S. agreed to all 10 of its demands. Meanwhile, the messaging from Washington, specifically from President Trump, indicated the discussions were strictly focused on a ceasefire framework, projecting optimism.
The contradiction is stark, but it's highly revealing of the domestic pressures each side faces. When you're negotiating during an active war, public statements are rarely about transparency. They are about managing domestic audiences.
So Tehran claiming total victory on its 10 demands is meant for domestic consumption.
Completely. It's projecting strength to a population dealing with severe economic anxiety. Conversely, the U.S. administration projecting a calm, imminent ceasefire helps stabilize global markets and project diplomatic control.
But practically, how do you even begin a substantive conversation when the two sides are in completely different realities?
Well, the reality of high-stakes first-round negotiations is that expectations shouldn't be high. The primary objective isn't to walk away with a signed treaty. It's simply an attempt to establish a baseline understanding of what the main principles even are.
Just figuring out what they're negotiating over.
Right. And based on these public statements, it appears they couldn't even establish that fundamental baseline.
And this isn't an isolated incident. The FDD analysis points out that J.D. Vance, who led the U.S. delegation in Pakistan, is actually the third major official in the Trump administration to attempt this.
Swallowing Wickoff and Jared Kushner.
Right. And when you track the outcomes of all three envoys, there is a distinct pattern, a cycle of diplomatic disappointment.
Yeah, if you analyze the rhetoric from Washington surrounding these mediation attempts, whether in Rome, Amman, or Pakistan, the tone has been remarkably consistent. They enter projecting immense optimism,
signaling to the markets a willingness to compromise.
Then the closed-door talks happen. They fail to materialize due to a massive gap in expectations, and the officials return to Washington facing disappointment. But they maintain a highly disciplined, positive, public posture.
They don't declare diplomacy dead.
No, the messaging remains. We are still optimistic. The door is still open. It's a deliberate choice to project strength while refusing to publicly close the door, keeping pressure on Tehran and markets calm.
Before we go further, if you're enjoying this deep dive, hit that like button and don't forget to subscribe for more tips.
Absolutely.
Now let's take a look at the logistics of these talks, because where they happen and who facilitates them tells us a lot about the shifting dynamics. Oman, historically the Switzerland of the Middle East, was effectively left out.
Yeah, they put in the most effort previously, but they were sidelined.
Instead, Saudi Arabia and specifically Pakistan stepped in. And the inclusion of Pakistan really requires some unpacking. What leverage does Islamabad actually have over Tehran to make them a viable middleman?
It's an exceptionally complex dynamic. On a foundational level, like Iran, Pakistan is an Islamic republic. That shared structural identity provides a baseline for dialogue, even though it's complicated by a major sectarian divide, Shia versus Sunni.
Right, the religious framing offers an entry point, but they also share a heavily militarized border and a complicated history of regional influence.
And Pakistan has cultivated a very specific, paradoxical diplomatic history. They are adept at navigating controversial waters. The FDD analysis explicitly points to Pakistan's history of operating as an ally to the West, while simultaneously housing figures like Osama bin Laden.
Oh, wow. That is a staggering precedent to bring up. It highlights a masterclass in playing both sides, taking billions in U.S. aid while harboring an adversary.
Exactly. It shows Pakistan knows how to maintain back-channel access with actors the U.S. fundamentally distrusts. It's the ultimate realpolitik. They know how to position themselves as the indispensable conduit in volatile situations.
But what's the incentive for Islamabad? Mediating between a superpower and a desperate regional power seems like a massive headache.
The benefits are huge. First, a direct national security incentive to prevent a total collapse of the Iranian regime. A power vacuum on their western border would be disastrous for their own stability.
Makes sense.
Second, playing the mediator elevates their diplomatic prestige globally. It gives them immense leverage in Washington. If Pakistan is the only country that can get Tehran to pick up the phone, the U.S. has to treat Islamabad with deference on other regional issues.
Yet, despite that experience, a middleman is ultimately just a middleman.
That is the hard limit of mediation. No matter how skilled Pakistani diplomats are, they cannot force Washington or Tehran to cross their respective red lines.
They can provide the table, but they can't alter the leverage.
Right. And right now, Tehran is operating from a place of deep economic desperation, which breeds maximalist demands.
Now let's take a look at the specific sticking points holding up these peace talks. By the end of this deep dive, you'll be able to see right through the diplomatic spin in no time. Let's start with the first of the three hurdles: nuclear ambitions.
The central sticking point for over a decade.
Washington wants a 20-year halt on all uranium enrichment. Tehran counters with 5 to 10 years. But the real friction isn't just the timeline, is it? It's the physical hardware, the centrifuges.
The distinction between a temporary halt and permanent dismantlement is the entire crux of the standoff. We have to look at the previous agreement, the JCPOA, brokered under the Obama administration.
Which is built around robust monitoring.
Correct. The JCPOA required Iran to reduce its stockpile and limit enrichment levels, but it allowed them to maintain the underlying capability. They didn't have to permanently destroy their advanced centrifuges. Thousands were just disconnected, placed under seal, and monitored.
So they still had the highly specialized machinery sitting right there in the warehouse, essentially taking the bullets out of the gun, but keeping the gun locked in a safe.
That's an accurate mechanical comparison. And because they kept the physical capability, they maintained a calculable breakout period, the time it would take to ramp those centrifuges back up and produce weapons-grade material if they kicked out the inspectors.
And for President Trump, leaving that machinery intact is an absolute red line.
Yes. The current administration argues that a 5 or 10-year pause where centrifuges remain intact simply delays an inevitable threat. For Washington, the risk is too high.
The rhetoric from the president is incredibly blunt. In the transcript, there's a direct quote from Trump. "If they had a nuclear weapon, you would be calling everybody over there, sir, and you don't want to do that."
It perfectly encapsulates the U.S. strategic view. A nuclear-armed Iran fundamentally rewrites the power dynamic of the entire Middle East.
You can't just postpone the threat if they keep the machinery.
Exactly. The core question is, are the centrifuges physically destroyed or just unplugged? If Tehran refuses to give them up, Washington asks, how is this new framework any better than the JCPOA we already walked away from?
So that's the heavy historical sticking point. But then we move to the second one presented in Pakistan, which frankly feels bizarre: war compensation. Tehran is actively demanding financial compensation from the U.S. for a conflict they effectively instigated.
It sounds absurd when viewed purely as a diplomatic demand, but connected to Iran's domestic economic crisis, it makes perfect, cynical sense. It's a calculated disguise.
A disguise for what?
A desperate plea for sanctions relief. The Iranian economy is suffocating. They urgently need capital to rebuild depleted munitions and fight systemic inflation.
Let's break down that inflation mechanism. When a sanctioned country needs to fund its military but can't sell oil internationally, they often print domestic money to pay bills. That massive increase in money supply causes a currency to collapse and prices to skyrocket.
They are trapped in an inflationary death spiral. To break it, they desperately need to inject foreign hard currency into their market.
But they can't simply ask for sanctions relief at the table.
No, because domestically, asking for sanctions relief looks like capitulation. It looks like maximum pressure worked. But if they rebrand it as war compensation or reparations, they can sell it to hardliners as a massive victory.
It's an accounting trick played out as geopolitical theater, calling it a penalty fee so they don't look weak. Which leads perfectly into the third maximalist point: the Strait of Hormuz toll.
Right.
Tehran is demanding the right to charge commercial ships a toll to pass through the strait, comparing it to the Panama Canal. I have to pause here. The Panama Canal is a marvel of international engineering facilitating safe passage. The Panama Canal Authority doesn't attack passing vessels with explosive drones or fire ballistic missiles.
No, they certainly do not.
And it isn't managed by a designated foreign terrorist organization like the IRGC. How do they present that comparison with a straight face?
Because their entire negotiating posture is maximalist. They are aggressively testing boundaries. Tehran senses that President Trump strongly desires to conclude this conflict quickly.
Trump has said he views it as very close to over.
Exactly. When a desperate regime senses the opposing superpower wants a swift exit, their tactical response is to put absolutely everything on the table and demand all of it, no matter how outrageous.
Anchoring the negotiation at an absurd extreme, throwing spaghetti at the wall to see what sticks.
Precisely. They know the U.S. and the maritime community will never agree to an IRGC-run toll. It violates freedom of navigation. But by demanding it up front, it becomes a manufactured bargaining chip.
They can magnanimously concede the toll later in exchange for keeping centrifuges or getting some of that compensation cash.
Right. But anchoring talks in demands disconnected from reality makes mediation incredibly slow. So you have these three massive sticking points.
Yet both sides are publicly discussing extending the ceasefire. Based on what we just unpacked, an extension doesn't mean a breakthrough is imminent. It just means both sides found mutual utility in buying time.
We've reached a tactical plateau. Both sides benefit more from a prolonged pause than resuming hostilities.
Tehran needs a pause to project domestic stability and lift the shadow of U.S. strikes. The Trump administration benefits from a calm global market, with oil prices falling and stocks surging.
But buying time is not solving the problem. The core issues remain unresolved. What happens when the clock runs out? If diplomacy fails, the sources laid out three highly volatile escalation scenarios. Let's look at the global chessboard.
Scenario 1 is a return to proxy warfare.
Yes. Tehran's doctrine dictates they rarely engage in direct conventional warfare with a superior power.
They excel at towing the absolute edge of the red line, escalating violence without officially claiming responsibility. We saw this in the Strait before, not an official naval blockade, but a violent gray area using fast attack craft and drones.
If the ceasefire collapses, it is highly probable they activate their proxy militias to wage a shadow war, maintaining plausible deniability.
So plausible deniability is a core operational strategy. If an Iraqi militia, funded by the IRGC, launches a drone strike against energy infrastructure in Bahrain, Tehran gets the market panic it desires.
But because the missiles didn't launch from Iranian soil, they avoid an automatic U.S. military reprisal against Iran. They operate with intentional, engineered uncertainty.
Projecting an aura of domestic calm while orchestrating regional chaos.
Exactly.
Okay, scenario 2 looks at Washington's response. The U.S. negotiates from strength. If talks fail, Washington could dramatically escalate the pressure campaign, ensuring military threats are credible.
But we have to analyze this through the lens of timing. Geopolitics is inextricably linked to domestic politics. How confident does the White House feel about risking military escalation right before critical U.S. midterm elections?
Right, the U.S. economy is stabilizing. Launching a new military campaign could spike global gas prices right before voters go to the polls. Historically, high gas prices are disastrous for an incumbent party in midterms.
Domestic constraints heavily influence international strategy. Those pressures might deter the U.S. from a heavy-handed response. Ironically, Tehran's awareness of these U.S. domestic constraints might embolden them to escalate via proxies.
Believing Washington is too politically paralyzed to respond. The interconnectedness of a voter in an Ohio gas pump and a militia commander in Iraq is just staggering.
It really is.
Which brings us to scenario 3, a geopolitical earthquake. The U.S. simply walks away.
Yeah, a very real scenario where the U.S. decides a negotiated settlement is impossible due to Tehran's demands, decides further entanglement isn't in its national interest, abandons its demands, and just walks out.
Packs up the diplomatic presence, withdraws the carrier strike groups, and says, "We're out. Good luck." That would mean containing a hostile Iran would fall entirely on the European Union and the Persian Gulf Arab states.
Navigating the mess alone, without the U.S. as the primary military shield. It's a paradigm-shifting possibility if the sticking points prove unresolvable.
But there is a massive wild card hovering over all this, the Russia and China question. China supposedly agreed not to send weapons to Iran. But what if that public posture is a facade? What if Beijing and Moscow are actively funneling advanced weapons and drones to Iran right now, under the radar?
It changes the entire global framework. It's the ultimate geopolitical litmus test. If concrete evidence emerges that they are blatantly violating sanctions to militarily prop up the Islamic Republic,
it drastically alters the calculus in Washington. It transitions them from difficult partners of convenience to active adversarial allies engaged in a proxy war against the U.S.
Exactly. How China and Russia choose to act right now will dictate how the U.S. views and plans against its major adversaries for the next 10 to 20 years. Does China see the current Iranian regime as a critical piece of its anti-Western coalition that it is willing to bet its capital on?
Even if it means openly opposing the U.S. military. And if the answer is yes, we're looking at a new Cold War architecture. The implications stretch far beyond the Strait of Hormuz.
Far beyond.
Pulling all these intricate threads together, we're witnessing a massive balancing act. The blunt instrument of military pressure colliding with global economic realities. U.S. midterm elections dictating international posturing. And the foundational alliances of the 21st century being tested in real time.
It is an immense amount to synthesize.
To summarize our journey today, we unpack the fragile nature of the Strait of Hormuz, why a VIP pass for Chinese shipping doesn't fix global supply chains, and the immense difficulty of the Pakistan-mediated talks. We dissected Tehran's maximalist demands, nuclear centrifuges, disguised war compensation, and that absurd Panama Canal-style toll. And we explored the looming operational threats of proxy escalation, U.S. domestic politics, and the massive implications of covert involvement by China and Russia.
Understanding these underlying mechanisms, the actual why and how behind the headlines, is absolutely crucial. And I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over, building on scenario 3.
Go for it.
If the United States ultimately decides that the juice simply isn't worth the squeeze, if Washington walks away from the table due to maximalist demands in domestic elections, what exactly does the Middle East look like tomorrow? What happens to the global balance of power if the EU and the Arab states are suddenly left to deal with a desperate, financially starved, aggressively nuclear-ambitious Iran entirely on their own without the American security umbrella?
That is a chilling, paradigm-shifting question, one that will likely define the next decade of international relations. Thanks for watching. If you like this, hit like and subscribe, leave a comment below, and check out my other videos for more insights.